Kingdom Claus. Book 2. Of War and Snow. By Adam David Brown. Chapter 6. Donner and Blitzen. A crisp morning broke over Nottenburg as the subtle clouds shrouded the sunrise in pink and orange blankets. The snow atop Maisenvogt gleamed a silvery light, as though it had captured what morning sun the clouds could not, and was taunting them with such an accolade. Upon the still air was a heavy smell of snow, as deep in the west, a hearty storm was brewing. The western horizon was a thick and solid pale white wall that loomed over the far-off mountains in stark contrast to the brilliant sunrise. As the southern realm of the Free Mountains prepared for their mission, the envoy of Claus was making ready as well, and at this time, neither of the two parties would know the severity of the moments that would follow. Away in the Free Mountains, a young Vendigo messenger was preparing for a mission of uncertainty. And within the walls of Nottenburg, a task of goodwill was riddled with a lurking dread, as though the ones recruited for such a mission were not just simply supplying aid, but stepping onto a battleground as well. There was a steeping tension among the envoy that whistled softly like a tea kettle that was almost ready to boil. None of them spoke of it, but it was most certainly present. They were more than willing to do their duty, but a feeling of doom seeped into them, as water finds its way into a cavern, a slow sliver of a stream that eventually carves a path through stone. The envoy was comprised of 25 troops from Nottenburg and 25 troops of Captain Veldery's company from the Iron City. 50 troops in all to be led by the singular command of Vixen, High Lieutenant and one of the 8 spears. It would be this fact that struck a foul chord with Donner, and this angst from the young spear would resonate through the entire company like a note from a broken harp. Donner often disagreed with the king, and on this occasion, he did so even more staunchly. The king's decision to appoint Vixen with the command of the mountain-bound envoy did not set easy with him. To Donner, sending one of the kingdom's most valuable lieutenants on a goodwill mission in the midst of war was folly beyond compare. The bigger picture escaped him as he thought of the whole ordeal as a tremendous waste of resources, and didn't think of the Free Mountains with any reverence. To him, they were already lost to Amaranth, and it was a fool's paradise to think otherwise. He knew of the mountains' strategic importance and knew full well that they were a clear road to subdue the northwestern realm. Unhindered by the first 3 garrisons, the enemy would chisel a path directly into Nottenburg itself. He had no faith in the mountain folk's ability to stop the onslaught, and in his mind, had already concluded their defeat. He would argue to use the kingdom's means to defend its borders and strike out against its enemy, to not waste strength with defending and aiding lands that were not theirs, and to which had no such obligations to do so. He thought it best to let the folk of the Free Mountains do as they've done and hold to their ancient creeds, and to fend for themselves in accordance. His opinion was fierce enough to make him forget his place in the council and thus would raise Claus's scorn more than his ears. To Claus, Donner was a brave warrior who handled battle as easily as ringing a bell. The king held the young spear in high regard and had often said that he was too young to be so wise in war. Lately, however, the king's opinion of Donner had somewhat lessened, viewing him as more of a disobedient child than one of his highest lieutenants. Be it the stress of the long waging war or frustration from his stalemated position, Donner had become embittered and was starting to behave as a malcontent of the king, and the men in Donner's company felt this more so than the other troops of Nottenburg. Each of the 8 spears had a legion of soldiers at their command. These soldiers were the elite warriors of all the northwestern realm and, though they were loyal to the king, they were more so towards their captains. They trained together, fought together, and essentially were raised together. The 8 spears and their legions were a brethren within a brethren, a brotherhood of an unbreakable bond, and if one of the 8 spears happened to be displeased with the king's actions, the troops in their service felt the weight as well. The frustration that lay upon Donner now hung like a haze over his troops. Even though none of Donner's station were part of the mission to the mountains, they still felt it folly to send troops away from Nottenburg at a time of war. They knew it was not their place to voice opinions on the matter and dared not speak against the king's command. Instead, they chose silence and let Donner be the sharp tongue of disagreement. This was only fitting, after all it was Donner's displeasure in the matter that caused the morale amongst his men to turn sour. Rumors began to spread through his ranks and the troops believed that the Free Mountains had already been taken by the enemy, and an ambush lay in wait for the envoy. The envoy was far from being any sort of vanguard for battle. It was only made up of 50 troops and sleighs loaded with supplies meant to be given to friends in times of need. Many of the troops believed that the mountains were crawling with Amaranthian soldiers, waiting for Claus's kindness to lead the envoy right into their trap. The envoy being led by such a mighty man as Vixen would make little difference if the company was surrounded. These sorts of thoughts were racing through the minds of the troops as they watched the envoy prepare for their march to the mountains. Many felt that it would be the last time they would see their comrades. If this would indeed be the last time, it would be made even more grievous given the situation. Amongst the men of Claus, it was far better to fall in open war than to be slain from an ambush. Rumors have a way of being affirming, even if there isn't much evidence to prove them true, and most of the troops in Nottenburg had convinced themselves of an inevitable trap that patiently awaited the envoy. Despite there being no word of Amaranth's troops getting any further than Grotto's village, Claus' rank surmised that the entirety of the Free Mountains were now held by the enemy. Speculation can be dangerous, and the morale of the troops in Nottenburg suffered for it. The envoy now gathered in the courtyard before the great castle, their breath billowed as steam in the crisp morning air. They awaited the command to embark, and away in the great hall, King Claus stood with General Blitzen, discussing the final preparations for the envoy. These were dangerous times, and Claus had sent numerous envoys to the Free Mountains as of late, so the plan was nothing new or surprising. Lieutenant Vixen is to lead the company to the northern pass and make for Hern's village. "'Tis a pity such a plan is routine to us, ruthless times, indeed," Claus said as he stroked his white beard. "Aye, sire. Desperation is a curious thing. I'm surprised the tribes would accept our help. They hold to their own affairs, and I'm pleased that our friendship would go beyond their creed," Blitzen replied in a hopeful tone. The two turned and walked through the great hall and down the stairs, talking as they made their way through the castle. "The chieftains are pressed, more so than they've ever been. Amaranth encroaches on their lands as he does ours. We have the benefit of fortifications and armies in our defense, they have not such things. The mountains are their fortress and the trees be their walls. But against such an enemy of rampant viciousness, such determined wrath, the tribes will not hold, and we must do what we can," Claus said, his red cape flowing as he strode. "What of the rumors, your highness? The men seem to think the mountains are lost," Blitzen said. Claus gave a hearty laugh and replied, "I can only command their actions, not their thoughts, General. If they wish to think such things, then so be it. Perhaps these rumors will embolden them and make their constitutions as iron. Rumors are just that. No word of such a misfortune has come to any ear in Nottenburg. The path will be clear as it always is. Our men would have us believe that every tree in the mountains should hold a sword against them." King Claus and General Blitzen, two great men of the north, walked and talked beside one another as they continued through the great castle. Blitzen was as tall as Claus. He was a man of great stature, like his fathers before him. Upon his broad shoulders a dark blue cape hung and flowed like great wings behind him as he walked. The cape was clasped around his neck by a small silver chain with a blue gem at its center. He was dressed in dark blue and wore a brown leather vest that was trimmed in sandy fur. Dark blue was a color that suited him well and was one that the descendants of his clan wore proudly. Each of the 8 spears belonged to their own ancient clans that were all but gone and that they themselves were the last members of. Upon the settling of the north, these 8 clans were righteous defenders and upholders of law and order. When the throne of Claus was established, they swore an oath of service to the northwestern kingdom and vowed to protect the line of the king forevermore. They were known as the Gevir, the Everhorn, the 8 clans of antlers. The leaders of these 8 clans would become the first of the 8 spears, and their sons would continue their line of defense and service until the earth ended. The Gevir came from 3 different lands of the north: the forests, the plains, and the mountains. Each of the clans wore different colors to signify whence they came. Green to proclaim the forest, red would represent the setting sun over the plains, and blue would mirror the deep glistening snow upon the mountain tops. The 3 colors of the Gevir would be their own banners onto the north, and the 8 spears wore them proudly to this day. Blitzen was descended from the Gevir of the mountain, and dark blue kept to his helm as it did his father's. Claus and Blitzen reached the main hallway when out of the shadows came a voice. "I should say that the trees would not be as well armed as the shadow men that may hold station there, your highness." It was Donner. His green eyes sparkled in the torchlight as he stepped forward. "Lieutenant," "Stay your tongue before the king," Blitzen roared as he halted the young spear. "Lieutenant Donner, I have heard your concerns and I pay them no more mind now than I did when you first broached them to me. The mountains have held so far and the enemy would not have taken them so quickly since the last news was delivered onto me. I am very much aware of your grievances and that you wholeheartedly disagree with me, but your stalwart angst against my orders will not stay my command. You have made it clear that you believe it is a trap that I carelessly lead the envoy into. I have not changed your heart with my words, so I shall do so with action." Claus replied with a weary and annoyed huff as he continued walking towards the main doorway. "Then you would prove me right with the blood of our men, sire?" Donner snapped. Claus stopped and slowly turned. Blitzen's eyes were ablaze as Donner continued. "You would sign 50 death warrants to appease your faulty sense of friendship to savages? The evil of the enemy moves swift as sunlight, they would have surely swallowed the mountains whole by now. Those primitives would never hold their villages against such a tide, not with sticks and stones and the filth they call mounts. Your heart outweighs your head, and to send one of our brothers into the jaws of death is salt upon an open wound." Blitzen was speechless and Claus was overcome with anger at the young spear's audacity. He slowly walked towards Donner and said, "I do not know what it is you hold against the mountain folk, nor do I know what it is you hold against me, but speak like that to me again and I shall have you in shackles, Lieutenant." He stared fiercely at Donner until the young spear lowered his head. Claus turned to Blitzen and said, "General Blitzen, I should expect that you would keep your subordinates in a straighter line. I have no more need for the opinions of warriors today. You are both dismissed. I shall see off the envoy myself." Blitzen bowed as Claus stormed through the main doors and into the courtyard. Donner's head remained down as Blitzen turned to him and said, "Shackles would be too good for such words against the king. Your anger betrays you, Lieutenant. It is misplaced as well as folly." Donner raised his head and replied, "Folly indeed, 'tis folly to mutter wisdom upon deaf ears, unhearing by no affliction, but by vain choice. My warnings to our king are spoken loudly and yet are not heard. It's all but folly indeed that I should place such heavy stock in his ignorance. To have the voice of my heart echo through this great place, to be heard in every corner, every crack in its stone walls. To flutter around every beam and up and down every chimney, to have my warnings be heard by every ear except for the one who should listen is quite so my folly." His voice was low yet flaring, as a fire that had just been extinguished, but its embers still clung to a smouldering fury. Donner had grown quite accustomed to the king's wrath as of late and wondered every time he raised it if it would be the last. Donner's angst with the king would keep this only a wonder and not a worry. The young lieutenant had begun to lose confidence in the king's rule and Donner's concern for his own lashing tongue had lessened. Donner knew, as well as Blitzen, that punishment for such insubordination could be swift and harsh. Other than imprisonment, banishment could be the result of Donner's brash anger, which would cast him out of Claus' ranks and strip him of his distinguished position. It could also lead to expulsion from his station within the 8 Spears, which would bring immense shame upon his clan, a clan that was very few in number, but such a shame would be felt as it were a nation. Though he knew the consequences, Donner's ire could not be convinced of the severity of his actions. The threat in the southeast and the war it brought with it now spread to 2 fronts, and Donner's fear was overtaking him, to the point where his sensibility has faded away. Blitzen placed his hand firmly upon Donner's shoulder, sighed deeply, and said, "My brother, any act of goodwill, no matter how fruitless and foolish you may consider it, is a seed planted in defense of this realm. This blessed land would darken should any of its people suffer under the hand of the enemy. None of what you fear has come to fruition, nor has any of it been confirmed in the slightest, but we must act now to keep it that way. The king knows what is best, as did his forebears when they sculpted this kingdom out of the chaos, and as ours did as well, when they stood fast and wrought havoc into justice. Has your faith weakened so much as to make you forget such things? Where has your hope gone off to?" Donner turned his head and gazed away at nothing, as if he were caught up in a daydream and his mind struggled to forge a reply. After a short moment, he began to speak. "Our fathers would never believe that some bags of grain and a surplus of spears would halt the march of the enemy. Nor would they fool themselves into thinking that such deeds would justify the weakening of a castle's defenses. Our king's kindness shall cripple us, my captain, and his goodwill shall be like a ram that crumbles our walls from the inside. You ask of my faith? Donner paused and looked away, his eyes were filled with thought and looked as though a storm was behind them. He sighed heartedly and continued. Faith will not return our peace, faith will not strengthen our lines nor thicken our armor. It is an imaginary notion that would abandon us, and leave us to lay in heaps of bloody snow. It would shatter, as ranks of crooked pikes bear down upon us, and the biting teeth of poisoned swords chew away at our hearts. It is a whisper in a blizzard, the quiet howling of lunacy that only we can hear. Faith, my captain, my general, my brother, faith is a children's game and hope is the superstition of fools. All that could be heard was the crackling of the torches upon the walls. The coldness of Donner's words absorbed into Blitzen like a bitter wind, and there he stood, speechless and almost weakened at what he had just heard. He knew Donner had grown angry in the recent years, but clearly he was not aware of the dire extent of the damage it has caused. The young spear's anger had become like a septic wound, festering and oozing with filth. Blitzen knew not what to say next as he drew in a deep breath, hoping the words would flow in with the air. Quietly and slowly, Blitzen began to speak. Brother, over your actions I have command, but not over your faith. I can only determine your place on the battlefield, but in your heart I have no jurisdiction. I cannot counsel your hope, but I can warn against abandoning it. Hold on to it, my dear brother, there may be a day when that's all that you have left. Donner began to reply as the main doors opened. The morning light filled the hall as Halding stood there in the doorway. My sires, the king wishes your presence, Halding said as he held out his arm and motioned to the courtyard. Donner and Blitzen broke from their heavy conversation and walked out into the courtyard. There, in the crisp morning air, was amassed the company of the envoy standing at the ready. The king stood tall and proud before them, addressing their mission at hand. He then turned and looked at the two spears with eyes of stern steel. General Blitzen, I have changed the order of things. If our lieutenant is so filled with worry for this mission, then perhaps it would do him better to be an accompaniment to it. If his fear has boiled over, then let us take the kettle off of the fire. If our young spear is so unsure of my orders, it may very well do him good to see them carried out. After all, it is safer to bark criticism with the luxury of cover, but the braver and wiser man would wish to see what he criticizes. Claus said, as he slowly walked up the front steps. Donner's eyes glinted with anger as he tried to comprehend the point of the king's new orders. Donner already felt that it was folly to send one of their best lieutenants to the mountains, and the thought of sending yet another was absolutely ludicrous to him. He calmed himself and said, Your Highness. The king quickly raised his hand and said, Your zeal is appreciated, but wasted on me, my young lieutenant. The mildness of your voice does not fit the anger in your face. I can see that you are troubled by this, as you are with most things of late. The fire in your heart is one of the most helpful tools in the kingdom, we should keep it burning by putting it to good use. You disagree with my methods, but perhaps overseeing their fulfillment will ease your concerns. Do I have your trust on this, Lieutenant? A long and silent moment passed as the entire company anxiously awaited Donner's reply. It was though the very air had been sucked out of the courtyard and all that could be heard was the distant hammering of the blacksmiths. The anger left Donner's eyes, like fog being vanquished by sunlight. He straightened himself and proudly said, Yes, Your Highness. My spear is yours evermore. There was an unnoticeable sigh of relief from the company and Claus smiled slightly as he was briefly reminded of the Donner he once knew. It is settled. You are to ride with the envoy and share command with Lieutenant Vixen. You shall see firsthand that your fears are unwarranted. Prepare yourself, the envoy leaves within the hour. Halding, make ready Donner's steed, the king said in a hearty voice. Halding bowed and went on his way to the royal stables. With the briefing concluded, the king dismissed the company and the final preparations were laid. By mid-morning, the envoy was assembled and ready to embark. A line of 50 troops stood on the great road that stretched down through Nottenburg, 9 rows of 5 across with the first 2 rows upon broad steeds. The 1st and 5th soldiers of the 1st mounted row carried tall banners of Kingdom Claus. Behind the mounted soldiers were stern-faced infantry men with spears in hand that pointed upward to the sky. On this journey, they would be used mainly as walking sticks and each man hoped they wouldn't be needed as anything else. Behind the infantry were 5 supply sleighs, hitched with 2 broad steeds each. The sleighs were packed to capacity with bags of grain and flour, iron bars for fortifications, spears, and other various arms. At the helm of each were stalwart drivers, sitting up straight, with black leather reins tightly gripped in their hands. The sleigh at the very end of the line had 2 tall banners jutting up from its bunk. One beheld the Clausian crest, the other was simply plain white. At the front of the line, mounted proudly upon their steeds, were Vixen and Donna. In the bright sun, they looked like statues made of gemstones. Vixen shone as ruby, dressed in deep red, the colors of his clan. Donna was like an emerald, as green represented his line. Donna's clan came from the forests, far to the east in a long-forgotten realm. It would displease him to know that this clan was not unlike the mountain folk that he had such disdain for. However, had he known this, he more than likely would have simply ignored it. There they sat upon their snorting steeds, high in their saddles, proud and glorious representatives of their ancient clans. They held their fierce and magnificent spears, and their capes blew softly in the morning breeze as a horn was sounded, and the envoy began their journey to the mountains. Down through Nottenburg, through the great gates, and onward past the Iron City, they then made their southwestern heading. The morning sky was blue and clear, but over the mountains they could see a storm billowing forth.